Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into how researchers are partnering with educators
Oh, cool.
in DC schools to improve reading outcomes for students.
Okay.
And this is all happening through a research practice partnership.
Gotcha.
You might hear it called an RPP.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically researchers and teachers working together.
Yeah, that's a really powerful model because it kind of moves beyond research happening in a vacuum.
Right.
Researchers are getting real-time feedback, and teachers are getting cutting-edge strategies.
Exactly. And the two researchers that we're focusing on today are kind of at the forefront of this movement.
Okay.
We've got Dr. Danielle Gervais Sodani from American University,
Right.
and she just defended her dissertation.
Oh, wow. So this is
So brand new,
really new research.
very current. And then we also have Annie Murphy Karabell,
Okay.
and she's both teaching at American University and working on her doctorate at University of Maryland.
Wow, so she's got that dual perspective, like a researcher and a teacher educator.
Yeah.
That's so valuable to be able to see both sides of everything.
Definitely. And it's interesting, too, that they're both at these two different universities. So you can kind of see this collaborative
Yeah.
network going
Yeah, we'll
on.
go web.
Yeah. And, when I was looking into Dr. Sodani's background,
Mm-hmm.
I was so impressed by her track record of funding.
Oh, yeah.
Like, she got funding from the U.S. Department of Education, our National Science Foundation,
That's impressive.
really big organizations.
Yeah, that speaks to the potential impact of her work for sure.
Right? Like, these funders are very selective.
Yeah.
So it seems like her work is both rigorous but also relevant to these real-world challenges.
Yeah, and when you see what she's focusing on, it makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
She's looking at the learning mechanisms within these RPPs.
Mm-hmm.
So how do the partners really learn from each other?
Yeah, and it's a question I think a lot of people overlook.
Right.
We kind of assume collaboration is good, but her work is digging into the specifics of what makes these partnerships work.
Yeah, how do you create that feedback loop where everyone's learning and growing?
Right, and she also has a background in educational technology.
Oh, interesting.
So she did some research on how communication and learning differ in online versus face-to-face.
That's so relevant.
Especially now.
After the pandemic.
Exactly.
Right. All of that online learning.
So maybe her work can kind of give us some insights into how to make those online experiences better.
Yeah.
Now, shifting gears a little bit to Annie Murphy Karabell.
Okay.
So she's teaching reading instruction at American University,
Mm-hmm.
but she's also working on her doctorate at University of Maryland and focusing on early reading and writing.
Wow, that's a lot to juggle.
I know, it's really impressive.
Yeah, it shows a real commitment to both the theoretical and practical sides of education.
Right.
She's not just thinking about how reading should be taught.
Mm.
She's out there working with teachers.
Definitely. And she's not just teaching, she's also taking on these leadership roles in programs,
No,
like the Early Intervention Leadership Cohort and also the Collaborative for Reading Science and Inclusive Classrooms.
that's great.
And that one is actually funded by OSC's Special Education Enhancement Fund.
So that's great to see those connections, research and funding.
Right. It's really impactful.
Well, it means those initiatives could potentially scale up
Exactly.
and benefit a lot of students.
And get this, she's a board member of the DC chapter of the International Dyslexia Association
Oh, wow.
and a teacher mentor at the DC Reading Clinic.
That's a lot of hats.
It shows such a commitment to supporting those students who are facing reading challenges.
It's really inspiring.
It's one thing to study those difficulties,
Right.
but it's another to be actively involved with those students and families.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, what brings both of these researchers together is that they're collaborating on this RPP with the DC schools.
Okay, right. We talked about that earlier.
Yeah, just to kind of highlight it again,
Mm-hmm.
this partnership started in 2021.
Okay.
It includes 27 elementary schools,
Wow.
including dual language schools, so a wide range of students.
Yeah, that's a good point because that means these findings are going to be applicable to a more diverse group,
Right.
not just one narrow subset.
Exactly. And they're not just observing, they're co-creating professional development for educators.
Okay.
They're investigating barriers to implementing those good reading practices that we know about.
Yeah.
And they're studying how those K2 students are actually progressing.
I think that's so fascinating that they're looking at those barriers to implementation
Yeah.
because there's a lot of educational programs that seem good in theory but don't actually work in the classroom.
Right.
And so by understanding those barriers, we can make sure that those evidence-based strategies are actually making a difference.
Exactly. And what I think is really cool is that they're also studying how those RPP leaders are learning to support school leaders.
So they're not just focused on the students,
Yeah.
but they're also kind of thinking about how the adults in the system are collaborating.
Yeah, it's like a meta level of learning.
Yeah, a level of self-reflection that you don't see very often.
Hmm.
And by acknowledging that everyone's a learner, they're creating a more responsive and dynamic approach to this work.
Right. And it acknowledges that research isn't the only answer.
Right, everyone has something to bring to the table.
Exactly. Welcome back to the deep dive.
Yeah.
We've been learning about Dr. Sodani and Ms. Karabell
Mm-hmm.
and all their great work with this research practice partnership in
Right.
the DC schools. But I think let's kind of move beyond their backgrounds now
Okay.
and dig into some of their findings.
Yeah, like what are they actually finding out in the schools?
Right. Like that's where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, exactly.
So one of the things they're looking at are these barriers to implementation.
Okay.
Basically, like, why do some promising reading strategies not really work in the classroom?
Right, they sound great on paper,
Exactly.
but then
Yeah.
when you get into the classroom, it all falls apart.
Totally.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some of those barriers that they're finding?
Well, one of the most common ones is lack of time.
Oh, yeah, I bet.
Teachers are so overloaded, you
Yeah,
know,
Of course it is.
finding time for professional development, time for collaborating,
Right.
time for trying new strategies. It's really tough.
It's such a cliche at this point.
It is.
Like, we all know teachers need more time, but
Yeah, but nothing changes.
it doesn't happen.
But what I think is so interesting about their work is they're not just complaining about it.
Okay.
They're really digging into the specifics.
Oh, interesting.
Like, what types of time constraints are the worst?
Mm.
You know, are there specific strategies for making time that are more effective?
Right, so they're trying to find solutions.
Exactly. They're going beyond just the complaint.
And I think that's what makes it relevant for our listeners.
Yeah, for sure.
No matter what field you're in,
Yeah.
everyone's dealing with time constraints.
Yeah, time is the one thing we can't make more of.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Right?
So seeing how they're dealing with that in schools
Mm-hmm.
can maybe give us some ideas for our own work.
Definitely. And another barrier they talk about is lack of alignment,
Oh,
like between different initiatives.
schools get bombarded with new programs, new policies, you know.
Yeah, constantly changing.
Right, and a lot of times these things aren't coordinated.
And it's overwhelming.
It is. It's like juggling a dozen balls at once.
Exactly. No wonder some of them get dropped.
Right, and I think this speaks to a larger issue in education, which is, you know,
What's that?
just jumping on the latest trend without thinking about how it fits into everything else.
Oh, so they're trying to help schools be more strategic
Exactly.
instead of just adding more programs.
Right. Gonna make sure those programs actually work together.
Okay, so it's about being more intentional.
Yeah.
Now, all this talk about barriers, it might make it sound kind of negative.
Yeah.
But, I mean, they are seeing positive results, right?
They are. It's still early,
Okay.
but they are finding that the students in these schools that are part of the RPP,
Mm.
they're actually making bigger gains in reading than similar schools that aren't in the partnership.
Wow, so there's actual evidence that this is helping. It shows that these partnerships are worth the investment.
Yeah, that's huge.
It is.
Makes you wonder if it could work in other areas too,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
like math or science.
Yeah. Could we see these RPPs popping up everywhere?
Earlier we talked about how Dr. Sodani and Ms. Karabell are also studying how the leaders of this RPP are learning
Right.
to support school leaders.
Mm-hmm.
So can we talk about that a little more?
Yeah, what's interesting about that is that they're really analyzing their own process.
Okay.
You know, they're not just looking at how teachers and students are learning.
Right.
They're also thinking about how they themselves are growing as leaders.
It's like they're holding a mirror up to themselves.
Exactly. And what they're finding is that supporting school leaders requires a whole different set of skills.
Interesting.
It's not just about sharing research findings.
Okay.
It's about building relationships, fostering trust, and really understanding how schools work.
So it's not just about the what, it's about the how.
Exactly, the human side of things.
Right. And that's a lesson that I think goes way beyond education.
Yeah, anytime you're trying to make a change, you have to think about the people involved,
Our relationships.
the motivations, the potential resistance, you know?
Yeah.
Their work really shows us that research can't be done in a vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be grounded in the real world.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been talking about all this research with Dr. Sodani and Ms. Karabell in the DC schools.
Right, all about how they're using this research practice partnership.
Yeah, to figure out how to help kids learn to read better.
And we've talked about some of those barriers that get in the way.
Mm-hmm. Like, why don't good ideas always translate into real change?
Right, it's not always that easy.
But now I kind of want to shift gears a little bit
Okay.
and talk about the so what of it all.
Yeah, what does all this mean for our listener?
Right. Like we've learned a lot,
Mm-hmm.
but how can they actually use this information?
Right, we don't want this to just be an interesting story.
Yeah, we want it to be helpful.
So let's get practical.
Okay, so let's start with educators.
Right.
What can teachers and school leaders take away from this research?
Well, one of the big things is collaboration.
Okay.
And I don't just mean teachers working together. I mean that bigger partnership between researchers and practitioners.
Like breaking down those walls between research and the classroom?
Exactly. Like, imagine a world where teachers have access to all the latest research.
Yeah.
And researchers are getting feedback from the teachers.
So they're working together.
Yeah, that's what this RPP is doing.
The teachers could actually help shape the research questions.
Right from the very beginning. And researchers could help teachers figure out how to use that research in their classrooms.
That sounds pretty amazing.
It is a win-win for everyone.
So what else should educators keep in mind?
Well, we have to remember those barriers we talked about.
Right, like lack of time.
Exactly, lack of alignment.
Those are real problems.
They are, and we need to deal with them head on.
So it's not enough to just have a good idea.
Right, you have to think about how you'll give teachers the time and support they need.
Okay, so school leaders need to think about how to make things easier for teachers.
Exactly, streamline those initiatives.
Create more time for collaboration.
Give teachers the resources they need to actually learn and grow.
So it's about being more intentional about how we improve things.
Yeah, working smarter, not harder.
Now, what about policymakers?
Oh, that's a good question.
What can they learn from this?
Well, I think there's a good argument for investing in more of these partnerships.
Okay.
The RPPs, they can really make a difference.
So put money towards that.
But it's not just about the money.
It's about providing the right support.
Right, so what does that look like?
Yeah.
Well, it means funding professional development for teachers and researchers.
Okay, so they can learn how to work together better.
Exactly. And it means encouraging schools and universities to team up and giving them time to figure things out.
So not expecting results right away.
No, it takes time to build relationships and learn from mistakes.
It's a long-term investment.
Exactly. And policymakers also need to think about how their policies might actually be creating some of these barriers.
Well, that's interesting.
Like if they require a new reading program.
But don't give schools the money to actually implement it.
Exactly. Or if they create a system where teachers are constantly being judged on test scores.
That doesn't sound good.
No, it can really stifle creativity and collaboration.
So they need to think about the bigger picture.
Yeah, and how all the pieces fit together.
Now, what about parents and community members?
Oh, they have a really important role to play.
Okay, what can they do?
Well, they can advocate for more funding for schools.
Okay.
Especially for things like these RPPs.
That are showing good results.
Right. And they can push for policies that really help kids learn to read.
Support literacy.
And they can be involved in their own kids' education.
Like reading to them at home.
Exactly. Talking about books making reading a part of family life.
So create a love of reading.
Exactly. And they can also volunteer at schools or mentor students.
Yeah. There's a lot they can do.
There is so many ways to get involved.
You know, something that really struck me about all this research
Yeah.
is that everyone is learning.
I love that.
It's not just the students.
Right. The researchers are learning from the teachers are learning from the researchers.
Everyone's learning from the students.
Exactly. It reminds us that we all have something to teach and something to learn.
And when we remember that,
Yeah.
I think it makes education a lot more exciting.
Yeah, for sure.
So it's not just about data and research papers
It's about using what we know to make a difference.
to actually help people.
And I think that's what's so great about Dr. Sodani and Miss Karabell's work.
Yeah.
They're not just studying reading. They're trying to change the way we teach it and how we support teachers.
Yeah, and ultimately how we make education better for everyone.
For all students.
Well said. So for our listener who's been with us on this deep dive,
Yeah.
what's the one thing you hope they take away from all of this?
I hope they take away a sense of possibility, you know? Okay.
There are definitely challenges, but there are also people out there who are making real progress.
Finding solutions.
And maybe this episode will inspire our listener to be part of that change.
I love that. So if you want to learn more about Dr. Sodani and Miss Karabell,
Yeah.
you can check out the RPP Exchange podcast.
We'll include a link in the show notes.
And if you're curious about educational research in general,
Oh, stop here.
there's so much out there to explore.
Maybe you'll even start your own project.
That's a great idea. Well, that's all for this deep dive.
Thanks for joining us.
Until next time, keep diving deep and keep learning.